So welcome everybody to this Spotlights event focused on sentence inflation. My name is Andrea Coomber and I have the huge privilege of leading the Howard League for Penal Reform. As of this morning, there are 86,526 people in prisons in England and Wales, 83,034 men and 3,492 women. That's about 70,000 people who've been sentenced. And that's an increase on about 120 from this time last week and is nearly double the number of people at the time of Lord Woolf's report into the Strangeway riots of 1991. In that report, Lord Woolf warned that overcrowding has a mesmeric effect on the prison system and has absorbed energy which could have been used to improving prisons. In addition, prisons are expensive and have damaging effects on prisoners. It's therefore important, he said, to reduce the prison population to an unavoidable minimum. It's with this quote that a group of the country's most senior retired judges began a report on sentence inflation that the Howard League published on the 6th of September. Sentencing is one of our key priorities as an organisation, and it was a huge honour to work with this group of judges, Lords Woolf, Phillips, Thomas and Burnett, and Sir Brian Leveson, who joins us today. I expect that you have all read the report, which is probably why you've joined us today, but it sets out the extent of increases in sentencing over recent decades, the financial and human costs of increasing sentences, and the causes, which we'll go into over the next hour. It then makes recommendations for change, both in terms of future sentencing regimes, but also what could be done to ease the lot of those who are already serving very long sentences. Before I introduce our panel, a few housekeeping matters. Just to remind you that this event is being recorded. We have 116 people currently in the room, but more than nearly 300 people have registered for the event, so they'll be able to watch it back later. Please use the chat box to introduce yourself, but please do not put questions into the chat box. Please put any questions for the panel into the Q&A box, because it is very difficult for us to monitor both boxes. And I'll speak to the panel for about the next half hour, and then we'll open up the floor. Please do get your questions in quick, because we always seem to run out of time to get through them all. We'll finish just before 1 o'clock. So our panel for today, as I've mentioned, Sir Brian Leveson, who is one of the authors of this report, is a retired Lord Justice of Appeal, who is, as the report describes him, the only surviving president of the Queen's Bench Division, who was also the head of criminal justice. Rather unusually within the senior judiciary, before joining the High Court in 2000, Sir Brian was a criminal barrister and prosecutor, and since 2019, he has been the Investigatory Powers Commissioner. Our second panellist is Professor Nicola Padfield, who I'm going to call Nikki, because I can't really call her anything else. Nikki is a professor of criminal and penal justice and director of Cambridge Centre for Criminal Justice. She's one of the country's leading academics on sentencing law and practice, and we're really delighted that she serves on the Howard League Council and indeed helped us with this report. Our final panellist is Dwayne Patterson, who's a prison consultant. Dwayne served himself a very long sentence on the pre-IPP two-strike sentencing regime. With a 7-year original tariff, he served 22 years in prison, and we're absolutely thrilled that Dwayne's joining us today to talk about the human impact of a lot of these, the kind of things we're talking about. So we're going to start with you, Brian. If you could explain, just for members of the audience, and I appreciate we have some people in the audience who actually are judges, who probably know what you're about to say, other people who've been on the receiving end of sentencing practices, but there'll be other people who perhaps don't know what the process is. If you could just explain the process whereby a judge in a Crown Court today would come to a particular sentence, that would be great.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So the first thing to appreciate about sentencing is that it is impossible to commensurate a crime with years in custody or any sentence. They are conventional figures, and they are now driven in large part by advice provided to judges by the Sentencing Council. And the Sentencing Council operates to convert what is legislative priority, identified in acts which identify minimum terms, maximum terms, guiding principles of sentencing, into a series of sets of advice which can then help judges identify an appropriate sentence for an appropriate crime. So we look first at harm and then at culpability. And harm and culpability drive the starting point of a sentence. Then there are aggravating and mitigating features and discount for guilty plea. And so one arrives at a range of sentences for the judge to decide what is the most appropriate term for this particular crime if it's going to be custody. The critical thing here that the Sentencing Council was designed to ensure was a consistent approach to sentencing, so that those sentenced for crime will have the same approach adopted to them, whether they are being sentenced in Birmingham, Bristol, Bath, or Birmingham, or
Birmingham.
Bournemouth.
Yep.
I run out of B's. Bolton, there's another one. So that's different to that which it was when I started, where different courts could pass very different sentences as judges took different views of the gravity of crime. So this guideline, the Sentencing Council, is required to be followed. The legislation says that a judge must follow the guideline unless it's in the interests of justice not to do so, in which case they have to explain why their particular sentence is not consistent with the guideline. That's all they're required to do. They are still exercising a judgment. But it's very important to appreciate that the sentencing guidelines are in large part driven by the approach to sentencing identified in legislation.
And how has that approach changed over your time from being a barrister through to retiring as a Lord Justice of Appeal?
Oh, enormously. You described me as a prosecutor. I defended a fair amount of crime as well. And the position in the 1970s when I started was that maximum sentences were different. There was not the same legislative guidance on minimum terms or 2 strikes and you're out, or scales for murder. What judges then used was a vast 4-volume series of books called Thomas on Sentencing, which identified decisions of the Court of Appeal Criminal Division to try to encourage judges to pass consistent sentencing. But what's happened since the 1970s has had an enormous impact on the numbers that Andrea mentioned earlier. First of all, the amount of time served by prisoners has changed very dramatically. So when I started in 1970, everybody was entitled to 1/3 remission if they behaved themselves, and they were eligible for parole after 1/3, provided the sentence was longer than 18 months. So if I take a sentence of 3 years, you were eligible for parole after 1 year and were entitled to be released after 2 years. And that was the end of the sentence. There was no further intervention by the state. Now, at a minimum, you have to serve 18 months and you're on license for the remaining 18 months. So if you either commit a crime or breach the terms of your license, which may not involve criminality, then you can be recalled to prison. So the impact of the sentence carries on for the whole 3 years. For certain sentences now, the term to be served is 2/3, and you're then eligible for parole. So on top of that, the legislation has prescribed minimum terms for certain crimes, has prescribed minimum terms for those convicted previously of crime, and most significantly, has prescribed starting points for murder. And the reason that's so important is that because we try to maintain consistency of sentencing across the piece, increasing sentences for murder, which undeniably has been the effect of the Criminal Justice Act 2003, Schedule 21, has meant increasing sentences across a different range of crimes. The first person to link two different crimes was actually Lord Justice Lawton in 1975 in a case called Turner, where he prescribed the sentence for a bank robbery by reference to the term served for murder. And the increase in minimum terms for murder has had a very, very dramatic effect on sentences across the board.
Yeah, and when you started practicing, what was a average sentence for a single murder?
Well,
like in general terms.
yeah, well, before 2003, this was all done by the Secretary of State. So what happened was somebody was convicted of murder, and the judge simply told the defendant he'd go to prison for life. He then wrote a report to the Secretary of State, which advised on the minimum term that the person should serve for that murder. All those reports were moderated by the Chief Justice, who saw every single murder report. But then the Secretary of State made the decision. And what happened thereafter was that case law decided, particularly from the European Court of Human Rights, that these decisions were judicial, not executive. And the result was that the Criminal Justice Act of 2003 prescribed starting points for minimum terms, which were far higher than were then being recommended. The standard term for murder prior to 2003 was probably 15 years or less. But now it's much higher. And indeed, a written question from the House of Lords Business in 2023 showed that the average minimum term for murder rose from 13 years in 2000 to 21 years in 2021. And that's undeniably had an enormous impact on other sentences across the range as the judges try to maintain a consistency of approach between different types of crime. If I give one example, if a defendant has raped and eviscerated the life of a woman, a sexually orientated murder would have life served 30 years. How much less than that should somebody who's done, not killed, not caused death, but eviscerated somebody's life? And it's difficult to create these parallels, but it's what the justice system has to do to achieve consistency.
Yeah. Nikki, maybe we can come to you. If you could talk to us a bit about the drivers for these increased sentences. So Brian set out how it's happened, the extent of the change. What do you see as the reason this has happened?
Sure. Thank you very, very much for inviting me today and for this discussion. I think the judge's report is really important. It's really interesting who they think they're writing it for and who will listen. I hope not only the politicians, but also all judges, so to speak. They identify in their report two key drivers of sentence inflation. The first one is perhaps the most obvious, which is that it's a little bit to do with more people going to prison, but it's much more to do with the people who are going to prison are going for much longer, as Sir Brian was just explaining. So sentence inflation, it's a little bit more people, but it's the people who are going for much, much longer. And it's really dramatic. When I started I remember campaigning in 1990 against a prison population of 40,000. By September this year, it was 88,000. And I don't think we can say those figures too often, because they're not just figures, they're human beings, and they're in prison. So they're going to prison for longer. So Brian identified some of the key drivers: legislative change, Schedule 21 of the 2003 Act, more mandatory minimum, lots of legislative pressure to change. But one of the other things which I think is interesting, which the judges in their report identify, is the lack of confidence in the efficacy of non-custodial sentences. So far we've looked at the very long sentences getting much, much longer, but we've also got to look at the medium length sentences, the huge growth in the use of extended sentences. We've also, though, got to look at the people who would have got a community order a long time ago, the huge drop-off in the use of community orders being replaced by either short custodial sentences or suspended sentence orders. So there has been, I'm sure that they're right to identify the lack of confidence in the efficacy of community orders. Other issues which they don't talk about a lot in the report, but are identified and are really, really important, is, of course, the huge increase in recall to prison. We're very unusual as a European country in using recall as we do. And one of the things which depresses me about the current public debate, there's been a lot of debate about all these people coming out of prison early, as though it's a get out of jail free, but license conditions are very, very real. They're very, very real and burdensome, and huge numbers of people every year are recalled to prison, and it takes a long time to be re-released once you've been recalled for many people. So the drivers of sentence inflation, to go back to your question, are many and various. Yes, we can put the blame, if you like, in significant measure on Parliament, on governments talking tough on crime. But I think we also have to point a finger of blame, if we think it is blameworthy, on the judges themselves, who themselves have been doing the sentencing. I think the Sentencing Council is a really interesting body. So Brian mentioned consistency. Well, you can be consistently wrong as well as consistently right. I think it is really interesting on the extent to which the Sentencing Council might have been able to do a bit more to try and put a brake on sentence inflation. They would probably argue that A, it's not their job, and B, they're not resourced to do it. Resources lie behind so much of this, and I could go on more about that in relation to what we should do now, but I think you probably want to come to that a bit later on.
Yeah, I'll let Brian have a brief right of reply. I mean, I have to say, I spend a lot of time with judges, and I think there is a mix of people who I'll talk to, and they will feel awful about the sentence that they have found themselves having to impose that day, because they say that their hands are tied by legislation given the fact pattern. I then occasionally come across a judge who'll be excited about giving a 22-year-old a 38-year sentence. And then where I have a little less sort of sympathy, because I feel like they're kind of enjoying it. Brian?
Yeah, well, you're going to say I would say this, wouldn't I? First of all, judges are there to reflect what legislation has provided. And there is no doubt that we've tried in certain areas to moderate sentencing. I vividly remember when I was chairman of the Sentencing Council, we reduced and we advised the reduction on sentences on drugs mules, these women who swallow drugs or bring them into the country because they're under enormous pressure. And the flack that we received for advising a reduction on sentencing for drugs mules was very real. So it may be that we could have done a bit more, but I'm still of the view that we are not there to make criminal justice policy. We're there to implement what Parliament has decided and to ensure that there is a degree of consistency. I entirely agree with Nikki about recall. I mentioned it. That's one of the real drivers of increased sentencing, and one of the real drivers of prison population have been sentences like imprisonment for public protection, where the legislation was quite clear about the circumstances in which that sentence had to be passed. I know there's been a debate more recently about who was responsible for it. I have absolutely no doubt, having been there at the time, as to what the inevitable consequence of that legislation was going to be.
Yeah, and that was anticipated. I was actually reading this morning Lord Blunkett's evidence to the Justice Committee when they were doing their IPP thing, and he was asked about whether or not Lord Woolf had cautioned him about IPP sentences and given him advice, and he basically said Lord Woolf spent all his time telling me what not to do, warning that a lot of the things that we were not doing were going to be very bad, and I can't recall whether that was one of them or not. But I think Harry Woolf, over for that period of time, was raising alarms around 2 strikes, IPPs, Schedule 21 in a way that was really forceful, but frankly fell on deaf ears with that particular government. Let's move to Dwayne. Dwayne, I mean, as somebody who has been, I have to say, a sort of a victim of one of the sentencing regimes that the judges criticised in the report, the 2 strike sentence, and I have to say something that has, I think, too often fallen under the radar. Certainly our members in prison, when we talk about IPPs, will often remind us that there's the 2 strike sentencing regime that was a pre-IPP regime. There are still nearly 300 people locked up under it who suffer all of the same sort of injustices and distress that IPP prisoners, who we talk about a lot, suffer from. But you obviously were subject to that and then spent a long time in prison. I wonder if you have reflections on the paper and could maybe tell us about what those really long sentences sort of looked and felt like when you were in prison.
Yeah, first and foremost I would like to say good afternoon to the audience. And thank you for inviting me as well, also. Yeah, it's a difficult, it's a very difficult scenario that we face. Because one thing that I've always said to people as well, because there's a lot of emotions involved, especially debates on regards to whether people should serve longer custodial sentences or whether somebody should be, have shorter but more rehabilitative courses in place. I say this, Albert Einstein said, condemnation without investigation is the height of ignorance. Now, through my journey, I could say my odyssey through the criminal justice system, I considered it as human warehouses where there was no benefits at all. On regards to who was facilitating, you could say, the imprisonment of individuals as well, I felt that they had a lack of understanding. They also lacked pro-social skills, where we have to take into consideration as well that when majority of people, I was guilty for my particular offense. So most people that are in incarceration are, let's be honest, damaged, young and old men. So we understand that, and they also still have a duty of care. But what I found within those places as well was the concept that was used in like the 1800s as well, just lock them up and throw away the key. And we know that that concept doesn't work. It's been proven time in and time again. But we go to public demand, and it's only public demand is because they're being force-fed into a notion that in order to decrease criminal activities, individuals need to be incarcerated for a long period of time. Places are dire in the sense of because there's a lack of funding, there's overcrowding, the way that I can describe it as well is that what is a suitable accommodation for one person is now being squeezed for 2 or 3 people, where that I think socializing courses are non-existent. For example, as well, what tends to happen when you're incarcerated as well? They will do a sentence planning for you. So they will give you all the requirements that you would need to do in order for you then to be released. But the problem lies with these so-called courses as well. Some of them could be 18 months long. Also, the waiting list could also be about 18 months long. It may not be in the prison that you reside in at that particular moment in time. So there's a combination. So the time that you do get onto the courses, you've definitely gone past your tariff. But then being in the front of a parole board, they're saying that they cannot release you until you've actually completed these courses in the first place. So you're between a rock and a hard place.
And that's got worse because there are just more and more people, so fewer people are in the right place in the prison system. So you must have seen that over your time, that when you were earlier in prison, there were fewer people double bunked and fewer people unable to. Did you see that change?
Of course, I saw the dramatic change because I've been incarcerated for 22 years. So I've seen from where it was poorly managed in my times to when it's extremely poorly managed before being actually released as well, and the difficulties surrounding that as well. I'm not just going to be one-sided, because there were some people that were in a position of duty of care that wanted to make changes and adjustments, but they just didn't have the support behind that in order to do that and to facilitate that. It's very troubling as well, especially with like mental health issues, the way individuals are treated, where we know that they call it neurodivergence. It's identified in the real world, but in prison, they are considered to be a hindrance, a nuisance, a troublesome person, that the only way of actually dealing with them is putting them into solitary confinement or segregation, which actually increases their capacity to communicate and develop even more extreme mental health issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that we're certainly looking at it in the context of our work on sentencing, but other work around neurodivergence. And as you say, in the community now, we have a increasingly good understanding and sympathy for people who have autism or ADHD or these conditions. But I mean, I think the truth is that prisons are full of people with neurodivergent conditions, and the system does a poor job at providing them with appropriate adjustment and support, which I think we highlight in the report. But what do you think? I mean, the government has said that there should be a sentencing review. What would you like to see that considered, Dwayne?
You know what? I'll be honest with you, and I always try to never be negative as well. I always try to be positive. But one thing that I've learned as well, we like to sit at the dinner tables and discuss the problems of the world, but can't solve the problems of our own homes. So for me, charity starts at home. And yes, of course, we've come together now to discuss a very sensitive subject. But the reality of the situation is I'm a proactive person. I think there's lots of things that we can do. First and foremost is, if we're truly sincere in our mission of change, we need to get rid of the two-strike, and we need to really explore joint enterprise. We need to explore a lot of aspects that are adding, you could say, to the mass increase of individuals that are incarcerated. That's my philosophy.
Nikki, what about for you? What would you like to see the sentencing review look at?
I think I'd start with 2 points. My first point is that a sentencing review shouldn't just look at the moment of sentencing, just look at the rules on getting into prison, if you like, but has to recognise that sentencing is an ongoing process and has to look very carefully at the rules on getting out of prison or breach of community orders and so on, as well as the front door sentencing. And tied to that, my other important, I think, starting point is that the review has to look at the purposes of it all. At the moment, the purposes of sentencing are a mishmash of lots of different aims, which is, many people would say, statements as sort of the blindingly obvious. I think if we look at the aims of the system currently for young people, they are better aims than we have as the aims for adults. Personally, I would want to put the reduction of reoffending right up at the top of our aims of punishment. We have to focus on what works to reduce reoffending, and we've been incredibly bad at that in the last 20 years. And if we can actually look much more closely at rehabilitative activities in prisons, also on community orders, they have faded away. What's happened to the probation service has been tragic for, not for the probation service, but for we, the public, and people serving sentences. So if we can give a much better focus to reducing reoffending, I think a lot of change would fall into place.
Brian?
I agree with all that, but I would add this. There has to be a recognition that deterrence is not achieved simply by locking people up for longer.
Yeah.
Deterrence is achieved by detecting crime, not by the sentence that necessarily follows for those who are convicted of crime. And that requires a public education which is, I'm afraid, sadly lacking.
Yeah.
People in prison are not that group of persistent, deliberate offenders who've chosen a way of life, necessarily. There are people like that. There are people who need to be locked up for a very long time, who are very dangerous. But you only have to look at the mental health and drug problems of those in prison, at the literacy and numeracy of those in prison, to realize that a lot more social care needs to be devoted to those not merely who do commit crime, but who are those who are at the risk of committing crime, to keep them away from criminal justice issues. But I entirely agree with Nikki and what she says, and I don't disagree with Dwayne. I think some of the problems are, to some extent, individual, but in the main, they're systemic. We've got this enormous prison population with reducing funding for the Ministry of Justice, and therefore increasing time prisoners spend 23 hours locked up. That doesn't help them one little bit. And it's not surprising that those we release after long terms can't function without a great deal of help in the community. And it's abundantly clear that Dwayne is a shining example of somebody who's managed to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the unfortunate thing about Dwayne is he spends so long, like so many people, over tariff, and you sort of think, what is the point of being in that warehouse?
Of course.
For just so long. And I think it's worth remembering that the people with the lowest rates of reoffending for any kind of offence are lifers. Like if you serve a life sentence, you're far less likely to commit crime than if you are in prison for sort of anything else.
Yeah, but Dwayne's point that you can't get onto a course,
absolutely,
I mean, is just truly shocking.
Yeah, I think the other thing, I think you're right, absolutely right, Brian, about education, public education. I mean, we know, and it's raised by the judges in the report, that the public has a very poor understanding about crime and a very poor understanding about sentencing. I mean, the public's understanding, such as it is that sentences have got shorter and shorter. That's, every time I go on and have to talk to a journalist, that's always the starting point is this really true that the sentences have got longer? And it's like, not only have they got a little bit longer, like they've more than doubled. Which sentences have got longer? You sort of say, all of them. They've all got bigger. Like it's a really kind of basic public message And I do think that the judge's report starts to bring that to new audiences. And I should have said this at the outset. I mean, we've had incredibly positive feedback from a huge range of people about the report. I mean, I have to say, I think we were almost surprised by how sympathetically covered the report was across a range of press media outlets. No, Brian, I don't know what newspapers you read, but the vast majority of them were really positive.
No, I just have a thing about newspapers, Andrea.
No, I'm sure you do. I was in Life a Day in a Prison a few weeks ago, and in the Q&A at that one, from the front row, one of our members who's serving a life sentence had watched everything on the television, read everything about it, recounted to me the recommendations, and just said how encouraged he as a lifer felt that such an important group of people, a preeminent group of people, had recognized that sort of sentence he's now serving was too long, that it had got out of control. And that meant a lot, even if it wasn't going to make any hard differences for him. The fact that it had been recognized that that's the wrong direction of travel was hugely significant for him. So we have a lot of questions now. Let me quickly, it's hard, apologies. So those of you who've been here before know that I'm not very good at reading and talking at the same time. Yes, so this is one of the questions I think that was raised in the report. It says MPs often lobby the government on issues to increase sentence lengths on behalf of constituents who've suffered terrible tragedies. We refer to this in the report. Do you think there's a link between this political culture of campaigning for stiffer sentences for certain crimes and then the crisis we see in prisons? Nikki, do you want to, or Brian, anyone want to respond to that?
I'm quite happy to start and say, of course, we owe the victims of dreadful crimes, the families of murdered people and so on, enormous public sympathy. We don't treat victims very well in our system, and that we owe them a huge amount. But you shouldn't form sentencing policy on the basis of the rare, dreadful crimes. We recognise them, we show sympathy, but I think it's really, really important not to concentrate too much on rare, dreadful events when you're shaping policy. My question to you, Andrea, would be, you talk about response to the judges' reports. Have you had a political response to it? So Brian rightly said we have to put a large amount of the blame for sentence inflation on governments, on Parliament. All the wonderful people listening to here, taking part in this debate, many people are already convinced. But do you feel that the people that you really need to convince are listening? I'm sorry to throw a question back at you.
Yeah, I mean, I do think they will. I mean, I think that this particular group of people are quite difficult to ignore. I mean, as Alex Chalk said on the Today programme the day after the report came out, like, this is not a bunch of rabid lefty liberal campaigners. You know, this is 5 of the most senior judges, retired judges in the country, saying it's got out of hand. So I think there is a credibility that comes with this report that is sort of beyond reproach. And the response so far from ministers has been that they will take it into account. They have welcomed it, and we are in the process of organising a meeting with the judges and the minister. So I'm hopeful that it will provide the government, frankly, with some comfort in the sentencing review to consider the possibility of doing what it has to do, which is find a way to bring down sentence lengths, because that's how we are in this mess with the prison population. It's not because we've got more people committing more crimes. It's because people are going into prison and then they're just not coming out over every offence, every range of offence. So it's been a positive response from a lot of places, and there are people actually on this call. So it was welcomed by the Prison Governors Association, Tom Wheatley's, I think, with us today, and by a range of actors in the system as well, saying that they supported the intervention. Other questions?
Just before, can I just
well,
comment on this?
Yeah.
I entirely agree with Nikki that anybody who has lost a member of their family to murder or has been the subject of serious crime inevitably feels let down if the justice system does not pass a sentence which they consider commensurate to the enormous loss that they've felt. And one can't feel anything other than the most enormous sympathy for every single one of them. But that can't drive all our policies, because if it does, you get the result that we're getting. And so the answer to the question which was posed is, yes, I'm afraid that I do think that the individual examples proffered by those who've suffered loss have assisted in driving up sentences.
Right. I mean, there's a question here from Chris Cook asking about sort of politicians vying to be tougher than each other on crime, supported by a populist media that's obsessed with true crime and TV drama. And I mean, I think there is a very distorted view that the public gets about who's in prison, frankly, because of true crime. Joanne, maybe you can talk about a little about who actually is in prison, because it's not the people that the public. I mean, whenever I get interviewed by, like, I frequently get interviewed by journalists, and they'll talk about all the mass murderers and sadists, and it'll be like, well, that's not really who's in prison.
No, it's not. It is. It's really misrepresented on regard to the type of individuals that are actually incarcerated. It varies from individuals that have had, a very good upbringing, and for whatever kind of reasons, they've found themselves in an unfortunate position. It could be from what they call white collar offences, such as fraud and other other extremities such as murder as well. I will like to mirror something as well, what my other two colleagues actually said as well. First and foremost is I do not condone any violence, and I actually feel sorry for any victims or anybody that have suffered. I'm a true believer I believe in law and order, because without law there's no order, and without order there's total anarchy. But the thing that I hold the most is justice. And what is actually happening within the criminal justice system is unjust. And in order for all of us to live a very productive life, we can't try to ostracize ourselves away by sticking our heads in the sand, thinking that the problem is going to go away. And when we emerge, the problem is still there. So we need to find a productive way, putting emotions aside, and ask ourselves, what is the best way that we can collaborate something in order for the utopia that we're trying to build, rather than the dystopia?
Yeah.
Now, so it's a combination of all different types of individuals that are made up. For example, let's talk about myself just briefly, just very quickly. I have 9 sisters and 5 brothers. None of them has ever been in trouble with the law. They have from degrees to masters. My family, they always emphasized that education was the key to success. It was only one event that happened in my life when I was 10 years of age, and youths asked me to relinquish my jacket, which I refused, and I was badly beaten. I went to the hospital and I said to my mum, it will never happen to me again. That was the transition for me. So just to give people a clear insight of sometimes an incident can happen, an event can happen in your life that changes the whole course of events.
Absolutely. I mean, and look, I appreciate there are some people who've committed very serious offences and who are not safe for the public, but I think even people who've committed really serious offences, frankly, don't represent a general danger to the public for the next 30 years, like the sentencing regime would suggest. There's a question here from Jonathan about, have we lost the focus about what success criteria for sentencing really are? Nikki, do you have thoughts on that?
It's a wonderful question, because what is success? To mention recall again, you can say recalling a risky offender to prison can be seen as success. recalling them can be seen as failure. So yeah, we need to discuss what is success. And from my point of view, we've got to have this focus on reducing reoffending, because as long as we really focus on that, then we have clear measures of success. And if you really wanted to reduce reoffending, you definitely wouldn't have the sort of prisons that we have at the moment. You wouldn't keep people in them for as long as we're keeping them in at the moment. Much better support for ex-offenders in the community with drug, alcohol, mental health issues, accommodation issues. It's sort of obvious that if you keep your focus very clearly on reducing reoffending, then your measures of success can be clear. And we know what works to reduce reoffending, all those things I just mentioned.
I agree with that, but I think one's got to be a bit careful that one accepts that the system is human. One of my great concerns about the parole board is that they can release 100 people who commit no crime and nobody hears anything about it. They release somebody who does something horrible, and then the criticism falls very, very heavily on them. And the concern therefore becomes that they become risk averse to criticism. And it's the same with judges. If they're held up to the public as having been soft, perhaps because a sentence of theirs has been increased by the Court of Appeal, they will be more cautious the next time. Whereas we actually have to recognise, serious though it may be, that we are human. We've got to do our best to get it right, but that doesn't mean to say we are always going to get it right. And it may be a victim will flow because somebody who's been released then commits a crime. But at the end of the day, as a society, we've got to do more to help everybody, both in prison with rehabilitative courses and offender treatment and the rest of it, and also out of prison with probation services, with mental health, literacy and numeracy, accommodation, all those things that Nikki's just spoken about. This is the way that we become a more humane, a fairer and a juster society.
Thank you. Sorry, there are so many questions popping up. There is a question here for you, Brian, about Lawton in Turner, which you mentioned, which was a case about robbery, and Lord Justice Lawton attached the robbery sentence to what the tariff would be for murder. And Stephen asks whether or not Lawton J was wrong to correlate like the sensibly and fairly with the sentence for murder. I mean, Stephen's gone obviously and read the Turner judgment. Well done, Stephen. I really struggled to find it when we do the report, I have to say. But if he was right and everything hinges on the minimum custodial periods now imposed for murder, you know, when you've got a government that's talking about taking back the streets and promising to have tough new penalties for offenders, how really do you see a path through that?
I think it's very difficult, but I do think that there has to be a correlation across the piece. So my example of a woman eviscerated by rape, what's the right sentence if she's not been murdered? What's the right sentence for a fraudster who defrauds 1 million people of their pensions? I mean, these are difficult issues. And the truth is, we're trying to commensurate that which is incommensurable. There is no touchstone. We're just trying to keep the balance broadly right. That's why I say that it's inevitable that judges will take their lead from parliamentary direction. because that's what we're supposed to do. And it's very difficult for us to say, well, actually, Parliament have said this, but we're actually going to go a different way.
And what about the public mood music? I mean, when you're sentencing somebody for a particular crime, whether it's been high profile or, to what extent does that play a part? And to what extent should it play a part?
Well, I would like to think it doesn't play a part.
Yes, though, because judges are human.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's why I
So
say
most of you, I hear you're human.
I no, there's no, I can give you a positive guarantee that we're all human. I remember trying a case involving a youngster who was convicted of murder, 17-year-old. And the papers that day, it was a very high profile murder. The papers that day were saying life must mean life or whatever. And I wasn't going to do that. And I remember saying to this defendant, identifying what I believed was the right tariff according to the rules and the principles set out in the Act, but saying that nobody should misunderstand the gravity of this sentence. It will require you to serve longer than you have lived to date. And then only your release will be determined if the parole board think you're safe. And now I wasn't, in the end, criticised for the sentence, which was a racist-related murder, there's no question. But the mood music beforehand was a real drumbeat. And judges have to get used to dealing with that and trying to put it to one side.
The example of Lord Justice Lawton in Turner is an interesting one because, of course, robbery is one of the most difficult offences because there are robberies and robberies, and robberies include the grabbing of mobile phones in the street. So I think we have to be really conscious that, yes, top ends have necessarily been driven up by Schedule 21 and so on, but lower end ones, maybe we can recognise that there should be a greater breadth, a greater range of sentences, and we should worry about the lower end as much as the higher end sentences.
I hope, Nikki, that we do, although I'm a little bit out of it. And there's no doubt Lawton was talking about a bank robbery, just for those who don't spend all their time looking at the criminal appeal reports.
Trying to find it. We've only got 5 minutes left. I wonder, I mean, a number of the questions, I'm afraid we've not been able to, so many of them, haven't been able to get through them. A number of them talk about, what's possible now. We have a new government. It's a government that's inherited a system that the prisons are all full. When we talk to policymakers, we're often told that, we'll leave, a lot of the future direction will be determined through the sentencing review. I mean, a lot of focus is being put on sentences to sort this out. And if that's going to mean reducing the pressure on the prison population, presumably that means bringing down sentences. It would have to. So I wonder if any of you have thoughts on are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Do you think the government has the courage, or our Secretary of State for Justice, or indeed our Prime Minister has the courage to lead on talking about sentences?
I would hope so. We have a Prime Minister who really understands criminal justice, but the real driver now can't be sentences being passed today. It has to be on what is happening to those people who are currently in custody.
Yeah.
In other words, what's happening to the release provisions, the parole provisions, the help that's given to those who are released, because amending Schedule 21, and I'm not saying that they're going to do that, but if they were to amend Schedule 21, that's years in the future.
Yeah.
That's not going to affect anything today, but the problem we've got is urgent and instant and action this day?
I'm just going to put into the chat, because I'm just really good at technology, what the judges have recommended with respect to that. Nikki or Dwayne, do you have thoughts? Are you feeling like things are better or worse than they would have otherwise have been?
I'll go after you, Dwayne.
Oh, is it? Okay, thank you. I will say time will tell. But one thing that I would like to highlight as well, which I know it was touched upon just slightly, parole hearings. I think this is something that really needs to be explored as well. Because what the general public is unaware as well, the parole board system, because I was in front of the parole board 10 times, they have a system in place called probability. So what probability means is that, let's say that you've had a case and you were found not guilty. With the parole board, they can relook at that case and say that, well, in our opinion, we believe that you did commit that crime and you've not addressed that crime. So we're going to keep you an extra 2 years. These are things that need to be explored, which are not being explored. Because if the courts have found you not guilty and of your peers have found you not guilty, what gives the right of the parole board then to decide that, well, on probability, that we're going to hold you another 2 years because you've not addressed the issue which you've been found not guilty for?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's a really difficult issue, the basis of the evidence on which parole board makes its decisions. But to add to that also, the parole board, Sir Brian suggested that they might be risk averse because they're human beings. Well, the reality is if people have not got long-term accommodation and long-term support, the likelihood of somebody reoffending is actually much greater. So my answer to your question about, am I nervous about the future, hopeful for the future? There is no getting away from the fact that change won't happen without significant investment. Resources are essential to supporting offenders in their road to leading crime-free lives.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much to our panelists, to Dwayne, Nikki and Sir Brian for joining us and sharing their thoughts and various experiences of sentencing. This remains an absolute priority for us, and following up on the recommendations in the report, whether they are about sentencing regimes for the future, but also what to do about those people who are currently serving really long sentences and ways to accelerate their route out of prison. And I am constantly meeting people in prisons who are serving ridiculously long offences, ridiculously long sentences. I met a boy recently who will be released in 2050 when I will be I'll be 78 if I'm alive at all. And you just think, you know, how, and talking to the prison governor, sort of how am I meant to, how is the system meant to keep this person engaged in their own betterment for the next nearly 30 years? So it is an acute concern, and obviously we recognise that there are family members and children and loved ones and communities who miss these people and who suffer for their absence. And I was happy to see in the chat and in the Q&A box people putting notes on particular charities and initiatives that support these people. So huge thanks to those of you in the audience for coming. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all your questions. There are always too many. Please join me at home in clapping to thank our panel for their, this is embarrassing, but this is like, unfortunately, this is what we have to do. So thank you to the three of you for joining us today. You'll be able to watch this back on YouTube if you want to see it again or to share. Katie will be sending it out to everybody who registered later on. We do anticipate another Spotlights event in probably a few weeks' time in response to what we expect to be an unpleasant announcement from the government. So we will hopefully see you back here to talk about that in when that's announced. Sorry to be oblique, but there will be another Spotlight event probably in October or early November. So we look forward to having you back then. And yeah, thank you all for joining us. Have a lovely afternoon and an enjoyable, restful, restorative weekend. Thank you very much. Bye.